Alora adjusted Finley's coat as they stood at the crowded Charleston bus stop. The late afternoon air was heavy with the scent of salt from the nearby harbour, mingling with the earthy aroma of freshly fallen leaves. Finley, her 6-year-old daughter, held her mother's hand tightly, her small fingers wrapped around Alora's palm as she hummed a cheerful tune. It wasn't a tune Alora could bring herself to join. Her mind buzzed with thoughts of the new job she was heading to, a position that promised better pay, but carried uncertainties. As a private nurse, Alora had taken on various caregiving roles over the years, but the assignment at hand felt different, more daunting. The client was a reclusive billionaire, someone Alora knew only through whispered stories and the occasional headline. "Mummy, will I like this new place?" Finley asked, breaking the silence. Her wide eyes gleamed with curiosity, her energy a stark contrast to Alora's quiet apprehension. "I think so, sweetheart," Alora replied, her voice soft yet steady. "It's going to be a little different. But different isn't bad." Finley tilted her head, processing her mother's words in the earnest way children do. Alora offered a reassuring smile, even as her nerves churned. She didn't want Finley to sense her worry. It was hard enough navigating life as a single mom without adding unnecessary burdens to her daughter's young mind. When the bus finally arrived, Alora guided Finley aboard, settling her in the window seat. The ride to the mansion was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of passengers adjusting their bags. Outside, the scenery shifted from the bustling city streets to quieter, tree-lined neighborhoods. The homes became grander, more secluded, until they reached the outskirts of Charleston, where the bus stopped near a gated estate. "This is it, baby," Alora said, holding Finley's hand as they stepped off. She glanced up at the towering wrought-iron gates. Beyond them, a long gravel driveway snaked toward a sprawling mansion that seemed to loom larger with each step they took. A security guard approached, scanning Alora's paperwork before allowing them entry. As they walked up the driveway, the weight of the moment settled heavily on Alora's shoulders. She glanced at Finley, who skipped ahead, oblivious to her mother's tension. The mansion's exterior was breathtaking, its white columns gleaming against the setting sun. Ivy crept along its walls, softening its grandeur with an air of quiet dignity. Alora took a deep breath and rang the ornate brass doorbell. The heavy door creaked open, revealing a woman with a stern face and impeccable posture. "You must be Miss Harper," the woman said, her tone brisk. "I'm Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper, and this must be your daughter." Finley gave a shy smile, but Mrs. Wilson barely glanced her way. "Follow me," she instructed, stepping aside to let them in. Alora hesitated for a moment, taking in the opulent foyer. The space was vast, with high ceilings and polished wooden floors that gleamed under a massive crystal chandelier. A staircase with an intricately carved banister spiraled upward, disappearing into the second floor. "This way?" Mrs. Wilson said, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. Alora and Finley followed, their footsteps soft against the floor. The house exuded a quiet elegance, but there was something cold about it, a stillness that felt almost oppressive. As they reached the sitting room, Mrs. Wilson gestured for Alora to wait. "Mr. Beckett will see you shortly," she said before disappearing through a side door. Left alone with Finley, Alora crouched to meet her daughter's gaze. "Why don't you sit over there, honey?" she suggested, nodding toward a plush armchair near the fireplace. Finley nodded and scampered off, her bright energy a welcome contrast to the somber surroundings. Alora's stomach churned as she smoothed the front of her blouse, bracing herself for what was to come. This job was a chance for a better life, but why did it feel like stepping into the unknown? Alora barely had time to gather her thoughts before the door creaked open again. The figure that stepped through wasn't what she expected. Marcelino Beckett, the man she had read about in passing headlines, had an aura of quiet authority that filled the room. His tall frame leaned slightly on a sleek ebony cane, and his face, half shadowed by the room's soft light, bore a faint scar running from his cheekbone to the corner of his jaw. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice low and even, yet carrying a subtle edge of skepticism. His piercing gaze flicked to Finlay, who sat obliviously in the chair, and then back to Alora. "Yes, Mr. Beckett," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. She rose to her feet, straightening her posture in an attempt to match his composed demeanor. "I'm here as your nurse, assigned by the agency." Marcelino studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, making Alora acutely aware of the grandeur surrounding her and how small she felt within it. Finally, he nodded toward the couch opposite him. "Sit." It wasn't a request, but Alora complied without hesitation. Finlay peeked over the armrest of her chair, her curiosity bubbling to the surface as she watched the exchange. "You've read the file," Marcelino began, easing himself into an armchair with a calculated grace that spoke of his reliance on the cane. "You're aware of my situation." "I've been briefed, yes," Alora replied. She chose her words carefully, mindful of the hints of pain and pride in his tone. "I understand you've been through a difficult recovery. My role is to assist with your ongoing care and help make the process as smooth as possible." Marcelino's lips curved slightly, though it wasn't a smile. "That's what the others said." Alora tilted her head. "The others?" "The parade of professionals who came before you," he said, his tone clipped. "They were skilled, I'm sure, but they didn't last long. I hope you're not easily intimidated." His words hung in the air, a quiet challenge that Alora met with steady resolve. "I'm here to do my job, Mr. Beckett," she said firmly, "and I'm not one to walk away just because things are difficult." For the first time, Marcelino's gaze softened slightly, though the guarded walls remained firmly in place. Before he could respond, the door opened once more, and Mrs. Wilson returned, carrying a tray with tea and a plate of biscuits. "Mr. Beckett, will you require anything else this evening?" she asked, setting the tray on the table between them. "No, that will be all, Mrs. Wilson," he replied curtly. The housekeeper gave a polite nod and exited, her steps fading into the vastness of the mansion. As Marcelino reached for his cup, his movements deliberate, Finlay's voice piped up unexpectedly. "Mommy, who is he?" The innocence in her tone broke the tension like a pin to a balloon. Marcelino paused mid-reach, his sharp gaze snapping to Finlay. Alora felt her cheeks flush, but she managed a composed smile. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "this is Mr. Beckett. I'll be helping him with some work for a while." Finlay blinked, her young mind processing the introduction. "Hi, Mr. Beckett," she said brightly, her voice carrying the cheerful warmth of a child who knew no fear of strangers. "I'm Finlay." To Alora's surprise, Marcelino inclined his head ever so slightly. "Hello, Finlay." It was a simple exchange, but in that moment, Alora caught a flicker of something in Marcelino's expression. A hint of curiosity, perhaps even vulnerability. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual stoicism. "We'll start tomorrow," Marcelino said, his gaze shifting back to Alora. "Mrs. Wilson will show you to your quarters." Alora nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Beckett." He said nothing further, his silence signaling the end of the meeting. Alora rose, gesturing for Finlay to follow as Mrs. Wilson reappeared to lead them upstairs. The housekeeper's pace was brisk, her demeanor efficient, but Alora's thoughts lingered on Marcelino. Beneath his polished exterior, she sensed a man who was not as impenetrable as he wanted the world to believe. As they reached the guest quarters, Mrs. Wilson opened the door and gestured inside. "You'll find everything you need here," she said. "Breakfast is served at 7 sharp in the dining room." Alora thanked her and stepped inside with Finley. The room was elegant but welcoming, with large windows overlooking the estate's garden. A 4-poster bed stood against one wall, its crisp linens inviting after the long day. "Mommy, this place is big," Finley whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. "It is, isn't it?" Alora replied, kneeling to meet her daughter's gaze. "But remember, we're here to work, okay? Let's try our best to make this a good start." Finley nodded earnestly, her trust in her mother unwavering. Alora smiled, brushing a lock of hair from Finley's face before tucking her into the smaller bed by the window. As the room fell silent, Alora sat by the window, gazing out at the shadowy expanse of the estate. The night was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now she allowed herself a moment of calm. Little did she know, the man she had just met would soon upend her carefully constructed world in ways she could never have imagined. The next morning, Alora awoke to the soft glow of sunlight streaming through the curtains of her room. She glanced over at Finley, still sound asleep in her small bed, her breathing even and peaceful. The sight brought a brief moment of calm before the weight of the day ahead settled on her shoulders. Quietly, Alora slipped out of bed and began getting ready, ensuring she looked professional yet approachable. Today marked the real beginning of her new role, and she intended to make a good impression. By the time she and Finley reached the dining room, the long table was already impeccably set, with polished silverware gleaming under the light of a grand chandelier. Mrs. Wilson was there to greet them, her posture as rigid as ever. "Good morning, Miss Harper," she said briskly. Her gaze flickered to Finley, but quickly returned to Alora. "Mr. Beckett is already in his study. He prefers to begin his mornings undisturbed. I'll take care of the child while you attend to your duties." Alora's chest tightened at the housekeeper's direct tone, but she nodded. "Thank you. Finley, you'll be with Mrs. Wilson for a little while. Be on your best behavior, okay?" Finley nodded eagerly, her bright energy unshaken by the formal atmosphere. "Okay, Mummy," she said with a small grin, clearly fascinated by the grandeur around her. Mrs. Wilson extended a hand, and Finley hesitated for only a moment before taking it. Alora watched as her daughter was led away toward the garden, where a small play area had been set up. It eased her mind slightly, knowing that Finley would be safe and occupied. Alora made her way to the study, her heels clicking softly against the polished wooden floors. She paused before the heavy double doors, taking a deep breath before knocking lightly. "Come in," came the familiar low voice from within. Pushing the door open, Alora stepped into the room. Marcelino sat behind a large mahogany desk, his back straight and his cane resting against the edge. The study was a testament to sophistication, with towering bookshelves and elegant furnishings. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting a warm glow over the space, yet there was an undeniable air of detachment about it. "Good morning, Mr. Beckett," Alora said, keeping her tone calm but professional. Marcelino glanced up from the papers spread before him, his sharp gaze briefly appraising her. "You're punctual," he remarked, his voice neutral. "That's a good start." Alora resisted the urge to roll her eyes at the remark, reminding herself to remain composed. "Thank you. How would you like to begin today?" Marcelino gestured to a nearby chair. "Sit." She did as instructed, waiting for him to elaborate. After a pause, he leaned back slightly, his expression still guarded. "I'll be clear, Miss Harper. I value efficiency. I don't need sympathy, and I don't expect you to try to fix anything beyond the scope of your work. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, Mr. Beckett," Alora replied, meeting his gaze steadily. I'm here to assist with your recovery, not to interfere in your personal life. A faint flicker of approval crossed Marcelino's face, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Good. We'll begin with the routine outlined in the file. I assume you've reviewed it? I have, Alora said. Your physical therapy schedule, wound care requirements, and dietary adjustments are all noted. If there's anything additional you'd like to address, let me know. Marcelino nodded slightly. Very well. Let's start with the exercises. Alora moved to the therapy equipment that had been set up near the windows. She guided Marcelino through a series of movements designed to improve mobility in his injured leg and alleviate stiffness in his joints. He followed her instructions with meticulous precision, though his silence and the occasional wince made it clear he found the process challenging. You're doing well, Alora said encouragingly as he completed another set of stretches. Marcelino's sharp gaze flicked to her. I don't need empty reassurances. It's not empty, she replied calmly. Progress, no matter how small, is still progress. He said nothing, but his posture seemed to relax slightly as they continued. As the therapy session progressed, Alora began to notice subtle shifts in Marcelino's demeanor. Though his responses remained curt, he no longer seemed as openly dismissive. It wasn't much, but it was enough to suggest that he was at least willing to engage with the process. She guided him through the final set of exercises, ensuring each movement was precise and controlled. When they finished, Marcelino leaned back in his chair, his breathing measured but strained. Alora handed him a glass of water, which he accepted without a word. Your endurance has improved since the initial notes in your file, she said, her tone neutral but genuine. If we maintain consistency, I believe we'll see even better results in a few weeks. Marcelino set the glass down, his expression unreadable. We'll see. Alora didn't press further, recognizing that he wasn't one to give praise or entertain idle optimism. Instead, she shifted gears. Your next appointment with Dr. Ashton is scheduled for Friday. Would you like me to prepare a report on your progress before then? Marcelino raised an eyebrow, a hint of curiosity flickering in his eyes. You take initiative. That's unexpected. I find it's better to stay ahead of things, Alora replied simply. It keeps everything running smoothly. His lips curved slightly, more a smirk than a smile. A practical approach. I'll expect the report by Thursday. The conversation might have ended there, if not for the faint sound of laughter filtering in through the study's open window. Alora turned her head instinctively, recognizing Finley's bright, unmistakable giggle. She glanced outside to see her daughter chasing a butterfly across the garden, her carefree movements a stark contrast to the rigid formality of the estate. Marcelino followed her gaze, his features tightening slightly as he observed the scene. She's energetic. She is, Alora replied, her voice softening as she watched Finley. She has a way of bringing life to any room she's in. She doesn't find this place overwhelming, he asked, his tone neutral but edged with something unspoken. She's too young to feel that way, Alora said, glancing back at him. She sees beauty and possibility where adults see obstacles. Marcelino's expression remained unreadable, but the tension in his posture seemed to ease slightly. For a moment, silence settled between them, broken only by the distant sounds of Finley's laughter. Finally, Marcelino broke the quiet. She's lucky to have someone like you. The words caught Alora off guard, their sincerity unexpected. She met his gaze, searching for any hint of condescension or pretense, but found none. Thank you, she said quietly. The moment lingered briefly before Marcelino straightened, his tone returning to its usual brusqueness. That will be all for now. Mrs. Wilson will see you out. Alora stood, gathering her notes and offering a polite nod. I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Beckett. As she exited the study, Alora found herself reflecting on the exchange. Beneath Marcelino's guarded exterior, there were cracks, small, fleeting glimpses of the man hidden beneath the walls he had built. It was far too early to draw conclusions, but Alora sensed that, for all his resistance, Marcelino was not entirely unreachable. Later that afternoon, while Finley napped in their quarters, Mrs. Wilson stopped by with an update. "Mr. Beckett requested that you bring your daughter to the garden tomorrow," she said, her tone as formal as ever. "He has instructed the groundskeeper to prepare some activities suitable for her." Alora blinked in surprise, the unexpected gesture catching her off guard. "He did?" Mrs. Wilson gave a curt nod. "Mr. Beckett may seem reserved, but he values order and balance. Perhaps he sees the child as a way to offset certain aspects of his routine." Alora didn't know how to respond, so she simply thanked the housekeeper. As she closed the door behind Mrs. Wilson, a mixture of emotions swirled within her. Marcelino's invitation felt both intriguing and puzzling, a small step forward in what was shaping up to be a complex and unpredictable relationship. That night, as Alora tucked Finley into bed, her daughter looked up at her with wide, sleepy eyes. "Mommy, I think Mr. Beckett is nice." Alora smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from Finley's face. "Do you, sweetheart? Why is that?" "Because he doesn't smile, but his eyes are kind," Finley said simply, her words carrying the clarity only a child could offer. Alora pressed a gentle kiss to Finley's forehead. "Maybe you're right," she murmured. "Maybe there's more to him than meets the eye." As Finley drifted off to sleep, Alora sat by the window, gazing out at the darkened estate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time she felt a glimmer of hope that this arrangement might become something more than just a job. The next morning, the sunlight danced across the garden, casting a golden glow over the neatly trimmed hedges and vibrant flower beds. Finley, clutching a small wooden butterfly net, bounced with excitement as she followed Alora down the garden path. The air was filled with the faint hum of bees flitting between blossoms and the chirping of birds perched on the wrought-iron fence that bordered the estate. "Mommy, look!" Finley squealed, pointing at a monarch butterfly that hovered lazily near a cluster of daisies. "It's so pretty." "It is," Alora said, smiling at her daughter's unbridled enthusiasm. She glanced toward the veranda, where Marcelino stood observing them. Dressed in a tailored suit without the usual stiffness of his tie, he leaned lightly on his cane, his gaze unreadable. "You may begin," he said, his voice carrying across the garden. Though his words were directed at Alora, his attention lingered on Finley, who was already chasing the butterfly with an infectious giggle. Alora walked toward him, her steps steady but cautious. "You didn't have to arrange this," she said, her tone measured. "Finley would have been fine exploring on her own." Marcelino tilted his head slightly, his expression betraying a hint of curiosity. "Children thrive when given structure and purpose. I thought it might enhance her experience." Alora raised an eyebrow. "And you're an expert on children now?" "Hardly," he replied, his lips twitching in the faintest shadow of a smile. "But I've seen enough chaos to appreciate order." Their conversation was interrupted by Finley's triumphant shout. "I caught one!" she exclaimed, holding up the net with pride. The butterfly rested inside, its delicate wings fluttering as if testing its new confines. Marcelino watched as Finley approached, her small hands gripping the net tightly. "Be careful," he advised, his tone uncharacteristically gentle. "Butterflies are fragile creatures." Finley nodded solemnly, peering into the net with wide eyes. "I'll let it go soon," she promised. "I just wanted to see it up close." "Good," Marcelino said. "Kindness, even to the smallest things, reflects strength. Alora glanced at him, surprised by the unexpected depth of his words. It was a momentary glimpse into a man who, despite his aloof exterior, carried an awareness of fragility, both in others and perhaps in himself. As the morning unfolded, Marcelino remained nearby, offering quiet observations as Finlay explored the garden. Alora found herself relaxing, the formal boundaries of their relationship softening under the warm sun and the sound of Finlay's laughter. At one point, Marcelino gestured toward a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, inviting Alora to sit. "She's lively," he remarked, his gaze following Finlay as she darted between the flower beds. "She is," Alora agreed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Sometimes it's hard to keep up, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." Marcelino nodded thoughtfully, his gaze distant. Liveliness like that. It's fleeting. The world has a way of tempering it. "Maybe," Alora said, her voice firm, "but it doesn't mean we shouldn't protect it while it lasts." Marcelino turned to her, his expression unreadable once again. "And yet, protecting it can be exhausting, can't it?" Alora hesitated, his words striking a chord she didn't expect. "It can be," she admitted softly, "but that's part of being a parent." Marcelino seemed to consider this, his silence speaking volumes. As the morning wore on, Finlay's boundless energy continued to fill the garden. Marcelino and Alora watched in companionable silence as she moved from one discovery to the next. She plucked a daisy and held it aloft like a trophy, then crouched by a small patch of wildflowers, enraptured by a bumblebee as it darted from bloom to bloom. "Do you ever feel like you're her entire world?" Marcelino asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. Alora turned to him, momentarily caught off guard by the question. "Every day," she replied after a pause. "It's overwhelming sometimes, but also, it's everything." Marcelino nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Finlay. "That's a lot of weight to carry." "It is," Alora admitted, her voice steady. "But it's worth it. She's worth it." For a moment, Marcelino seemed on the verge of saying something more, but he hesitated, the words lingering unspoken. Instead, he shifted his attention back to Finlay, who was now inspecting a ladybug perched on the edge of her fingertip. "Mommy, look!" Finlay called, her face glowing with excitement. She rushed toward them, holding out her hand for them to see the tiny insect. "It's so small, but it's so strong. It can climb all the way up this blade of grass." Alora laughed softly, crouching to her daughter's level. "It is strong," she agreed. "Even small things can do incredible things." Marcelino knelt down as well, his movements deliberate as he balanced with his cane. The sight of him at eye level with Finlay, his normally imposing presence softened by the moment, made Alora pause. There was something unexpectedly human in his posture, a quiet humility she hadn't seen before. "What do you think, Mr. Beckett?" Finlay asked, her voice filled with curiosity. "Do you like ladybugs?" Marcelino studied the insect for a moment before answering. "They're resilient," he said finally. "They adapt, survive. There's a lesson in that." Finlay's face lit up at his answer, and she turned back to the ladybug with renewed fascination. "I think I like them even more now," she declared before gently placing the insect back on a flower. As Finlay skipped off to explore further, Marcelino straightened, his cane steadying him as he rose. "She's perceptive," he remarked, his tone tinged with something like admiration. "She's a child," Alora said, smiling. "They see the world more clearly than we do sometimes." "Perhaps," Marcelino mused, "or perhaps they simply haven't learned to cloud their vision yet." Alora didn't reply immediately, her thoughts drifting. Marcelino's words carried an edge of bitterness, but they were also undeniably true. She wondered what experiences had shaped his perspective. What moments in his life had led him to see the world through such a guarded lens? As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Mrs. Wilson appeared at the edge of the garden. "Lunch will be served shortly," she announced, her tone as crisp as ever. Finley ran over, her cheeks flushed from the morning's adventures. "Can we eat outside, Mommy?" she asked, her voice brimming with excitement. "It's so nice out here." Alora glanced at Marcelino, unsure if such a request would be welcome. To her surprise, he nodded. "The terrace should suffice," he said, motioning toward the shaded patio just off the garden. "Yay!" Finley cheered, darting ahead toward the house. Alora looked at Marcelino, a flicker of gratitude in her expression. "Thank you," she said quietly. He didn't respond, but the faintest hint of a smile touched the corner of his lips as he turned to follow Finley. Lunch on the terrace was a quiet but pleasant affair. Finley chattered happily about her morning discoveries, while Marcelino listened with what Alora could only describe as a quiet attentiveness. Though his expressions were subtle, she noticed the way his focus never wavered when Finley spoke, as if every word she said held weight. By the time the meal ended, Finley was yawning, her energy finally beginning to wane. Alora stood to take her back to their quarters, but before they left, Finley turned to Marcelino with a wide smile. "Thank you for letting me play in your garden, Mr. Beckett. It's the best garden ever." Marcelino inclined his head. "You're welcome, Finley." As they walked back to their room, Alora couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Marcelino's guarded exterior hadn't crumbled, but it had softened, if only slightly. It was a small step, but in a place like this, where every wall seemed impenetrable, it felt significant. Alora couldn't help but notice how quiet the mansion seemed that afternoon. Finley was napping after her energetic morning in the garden, leaving Alora with a rare stretch of time to herself. She decided to use it productively, sorting through some of the medical supplies and reviewing Marcelino's physical therapy schedule. As she worked, her thoughts kept drifting back to the subtle shifts she had observed in him over the past few days. The man she met initially, cold and unreachable, seemed to be showing cracks in his armor, small but undeniable. Her thoughts were interrupted when Mrs. Wilson appeared at the door. "Mr. Beckett is in the study," the housekeeper said briskly. "He's requested your presence." Alora set aside her notepad and followed Mrs. Wilson down the long corridor to the study. The mansion's stillness felt heavier here, the high ceilings and polished floors amplifying every step. She reached the study and knocked lightly. "Enter!" Marcelino's voice called from within. Alora stepped inside to find Marcelino seated in his usual spot behind the grand desk, but his posture was different, stiff, tense. His cane rested against the side of the chair, but his hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the window rather than on her. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Beckett?" Alora asked, keeping her tone professional but curious. Marcelino didn't look at her immediately. "Close the door," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Alora hesitated but complied, closing the heavy door behind her before taking a seat across from him. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, thick and uneasy. Finally, Marcelino spoke, his gaze still trained on the window. "Mrs. Wilson tells me you've been asking questions about my therapy and recovery." Alora frowned slightly. "Only to ensure I can provide the best care for you," she replied. "If I've overstepped—" "You haven't," Marcelino interrupted, his tone sharp but not unkind. He shifted his gaze to her, his expression unreadable. "But I can't help wondering, why are you so invested? This is just a job for you, isn't it?" Alora met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "It is a job," she said honestly. "But that doesn't mean I don't care about doing it well. You've been through something unimaginable, Mr. Beckett. Helping you recover isn't just about following a checklist, it's about treating you like a person. Marcelino's jaw tightened, and for a moment Alora thought she might have pushed too far, but then he exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "You're the first to say that," he admitted quietly. "Everyone else, they only see the scars." "They're part of you," Alora said gently, "but they don't define you." Marcelino looked at her for a long moment, something unspoken flickering in his eyes. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "What makes you so sure of that?" Alora hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Because I've had to believe the same about myself," she said finally, her voice steady. "We've all got scars, Mr. Beckett. Some just aren't as visible." Marcelino's gaze lingered on Alora, his expression softening ever so slightly. Her words seemed to resonate, breaking through some of the barriers he had so carefully constructed. For a moment, he appeared vulnerable, the sharpness in his features giving way to something almost wistful. "You've been through your own battles," he said, more a statement than a question. Alora nodded, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "I have. But I've learned that focusing on what's broken won't fix anything. It just keeps you stuck in the past." Marcelino leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly against the polished armrest. "The past," he repeated, almost to himself. "It's not so easy to leave behind." "Maybe not," Alora said softly, "but sometimes holding onto it only makes the wounds deeper." The room fell silent again, but it wasn't the heavy, oppressive quiet that usually filled the mansion. It felt different, thoughtful, almost fragile. Marcelino's guarded exterior wasn't gone, but there was a crack, a momentary glimpse of the man beneath. After a beat, Marcelino shifted in his chair. "There's a room," he said, his voice measured. "At the end of the west wing. It's locked for a reason." Alora tilted her head slightly, curiosity sparking at the edge of her thoughts. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you've asked questions," he replied, his tone steady but firm. "And because you should understand what you're dealing with before you try to offer answers." He reached into the desk drawer and withdrew a small brass key, placing it on the surface between them. Alora hesitated, unsure whether to take it. "Go," Marcelino said, his gaze fixed on her. "See for yourself." Alora swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She hadn't expected this, an invitation into the most private corners of his life. She reached for the key, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcelino nodded, his expression unreadable. "Consider it part of your job." The west wing of the mansion was quieter than the rest of the house, its dimly lit hallway lined with heavy doors. Alora clutched the brass key tightly in her hand as she approached the last door on the right. She hesitated, her breath catching as she slid the key into the lock. With a soft click, the door creaked open, revealing a room unlike any other in the estate. The air was heavy with a faint, musty scent, and the dim light from a single window illuminated the space. It was a shrine to the past, a room filled with photographs, newspaper clippings, and personal mementos. The walls were adorned with images of a younger Marcelino, his face unscarred, his expression carefree. In many of the photos, he stood beside a man Alora didn't recognize, but guessed must be Jason. A bookshelf near the window held an array of framed pictures, along with small trophies and other keepsakes. On the desk, a folded sailing map sat atop a stack of handwritten letters, their edges worn with time. Alora approached slowly, her fingers grazing the map as she imagined the memories it must carry. Then her gaze fell on a small photograph, tucked beneath a pile of papers. She picked it up carefully, her breath catching as she recognized Marcelino and Jason aboard a sleek sailboat, their grins wide and carefree. The backdrop of the open ocean seemed almost dreamlike, a stark contrast to the suffocating air of this room. "Jason," she murmured, tracing her fingers lightly over the image. That was before the storm. The voice startled her, and she turned to find Marcelino standing in the doorway. He leaned heavily on his cane, his expression a mixture of tension and resignation. "I didn't mean to intrude," Alora said quickly, setting the photograph back on the desk. "You didn't," Marcelino replied, stepping further into the room. "I told you to come here." Alora hesitated, watching him closely. "This room. It holds a lot of pain, doesn't it?" Marcelino nodded, his eyes distant as they scanned the photographs. "Jason and I grew up together. Sailing was our thing. That storm, it came out of nowhere. I thought I could handle it, but I was reckless. He didn't make it." Alora's chest tightened at the rawness in his voice. "You've been carrying this alone," she said softly. "People don't understand," Marcelino said, his tone clipped. "They think the scars are the worst part. But it's not the scars. It's knowing that I survived and he didn't." Alora stepped closer, her gaze steady. "Surviving doesn't make you guilty, Marcelino. It makes you human." For a long moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the photograph in her hand. Finally he exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing ever so slightly. "Maybe," he murmured, "but it doesn't feel that way." Alora placed a gentle hand on his arm, offering the smallest gesture of comfort. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Marcelino didn't reply, but he didn't pull away either. And in that moment, Alora knew that while the walls around him were still strong, they were no longer impenetrable. The morning air was crisp as Alora sipped her coffee on the small balcony outside her quarters. The tranquil view of the sprawling garden below was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions she had experienced the day before. She couldn't stop thinking about the room Marcelino had shown her and the pain he had carried alone for so long. A man so fiercely guarded had allowed her a glimpse into his most vulnerable corner. It felt like progress, but it also came with the weight of responsibility. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Setting her mug down, she opened it to find Mrs. Wilson standing there, her expression unreadable as always. "There's a visitor for you, Miss Harper," the housekeeper said, her tone brisk. "He's waiting in the sitting room." Alora blinked in surprise. "A visitor? Who?" "He introduced himself as Mr. Zayden Calloway," Mrs. Wilson replied. The name hit her like a jolt of electricity, and Alora felt her breath catch. Zayden, Finley's father. It had been years since she'd seen him, and his sudden arrival filled her with equal parts anger and apprehension. "Where's Finley?" Alora asked quickly. "She's still playing in the garden under the groundskeeper's supervision," Mrs. Wilson assured her. "I thought it best to inform you first." Alora nodded, her mind racing as she followed Mrs. Wilson down the hallway. When she reached the sitting room, she hesitated briefly before pushing the door open. Zayden stood by the fireplace, his tall frame as self-assured as she remembered. His dark hair was neatly styled, and his sharp suit gave him an air of polished confidence. But his presence, no matter how composed, stirred a storm of emotions within Alora. "Zayden," she said, her voice carefully measured. He turned, his expression softening when he saw her. "Alora," he greeted, "you look, well." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "What are you doing here?" Zayden sighed, spreading his hands in a gesture of conciliation. "I wanted to see you, and Finley." "After all this time?" Alora's voice was calm, but the edge of bitterness was unmistakable. "You've been gone for years, Zayden. Why now?" "I know," he said, his tone laced with regret. "I've made mistakes, big ones, but I'm here to make things right." Alora crossed her arms, her gaze steady. You can't just walk in and expect to fix everything. Finley doesn't even know you. She's my daughter, Zayden said, his voice firm but not unkind. I have a right to see her. Alora's heart twisted. As much as she wanted to shut the door on him completely, she knew it wasn't that simple. Finley deserved answers, deserved the chance to understand where she came from, but she also had to protect her daughter from further heartache. Before she could respond, the door opened, and Marcelino entered the room. His presence was as commanding as ever, his sharp eyes immediately assessing the situation. He glanced between Alora and Zayden, his expression cool and unreadable. I see we have a guest, Marcelino said, his tone calm but firm. Zayden turned to him, extending a hand. Zayden Calloway, he introduced himself. And you are? Marcelino ignored the hand, his gaze unwavering. Marcelino Beckett, I believe the more important question is, why are you here? Zayden dropped his hand, his confident demeanor faltering slightly under Marcelino's steady gaze. I'm here to see my daughter, he said, his voice losing some of its earlier edge. I assume Alora has told you about me. She has mentioned you, Marcelino replied, his tone impassive. But I wasn't under the impression that you were part of her or Finley's lives. Alora bristled at the tension crackling between the two men. This isn't your concern, Mr. Beckett, she interjected, her voice sharp enough to cut through the standoff. She turned to Zayden. If you're serious about wanting to see Finley, then we need to set some ground rules. Zayden nodded, his expression earnest. Anything you need, Alora. I just want a chance to know her. Alora studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity. While she wasn't convinced of his intentions, she also knew that Finley would eventually ask questions Alora wouldn't be able to answer on her own. She's in the garden, Alora said finally. But this will be brief. I'm not going to let her get hurt because you decided to show up out of nowhere. I understand, Zayden said, his voice subdued. Thank you. Marcelino stepped aside as Zayden moved toward the door, though his posture remained guarded. As soon as Zayden was out of earshot, Marcelino turned to Alora. You're letting him meet her? He asked, his tone quieter, but no less firm. I don't have much of a choice, Alora replied, her shoulders sagging slightly. Finley deserves the chance to know him, even if I have my doubts. Marcelino studied her for a moment, his sharp features softening. If he hurts her, or you, I won't stand by and watch. Alora met his gaze, surprised by the intensity of his words. There was no hesitation in his tone, no hint of formality. For the first time, she felt the weight of his concern, unfiltered and genuine. I can handle Zayden, she said, her voice steady. But thank you. Outside, Finley was crouched by a flower bed, intently examining a caterpillar inching its way along a leaf. When she looked up and saw Zayden approaching with Alora, she tilted her head in curiosity. Mommy, who's that? She asked, standing and brushing the dirt off her hands. Alora crouched beside her, keeping her tone calm and gentle. This is Zayden, she said. He's your father. Finley blinked, her wide eyes flicking between Alora and Zayden. My daddy, she repeated, her voice tinged with confusion. Yes, sweetheart, Alora said softly. He wanted to meet you. Zayden crouched down as well, his expression a mixture of hope and nervousness. Hi, Finley, he said, his voice warm but tentative. I've heard so much about you. You're even more amazing than I imagined. Finley hesitated, her small hands fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. Mommy talks about you sometimes, she said finally, but why weren't you here before? The question hung in the air, and Alora felt a pang of protectiveness as Zayden's face fell. He seemed to wrestle with his words before answering. I made some mistakes, he said, his voice thick with regret. "But I'm here now because I want to be part of your life, if you'll let me." Finley didn't reply immediately, her young mind processing his words. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, "but you have to be nice to Mommy." Zayden smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I promise." From a distance, Marcelino watched the exchange from the shadows of the veranda. His jaw tightened as he observed Zayden crouched at Finley's level, his polished demeanor contrasting with the rawness of the moment. Despite his better judgment, Marcelino felt a stirring of unease. He had grown used to Finley's bright laughter and Alora's quiet resilience, and the thought of someone disrupting their fragile stability set him on edge. For now, he would remain an observer. But deep down, Marcelino knew this wouldn't be the last time he'd have to confront Zayden Calloway and the complications he brought into their lives. The days following Zayden's visit were a whirlwind of emotions. Finley, curious and full of questions, seemed to take her father's sudden presence in stride, but Alora felt the weight of every interaction. She watched Zayden tread carefully, his attempts to bond with Finley laced with both sincerity and hesitation. Yet her guard remained firmly in place. Years of absence couldn't be undone by a few well-meaning gestures, and she wasn't ready to lower her defenses just yet. It was a quiet afternoon when Marcelino unexpectedly joined Alora in the garden. She had been trimming back a few overgrown rose bushes while Finley played nearby, her laughter drifting on the warm breeze. Marcelino's presence, as always, was commanding, though his posture was relaxed, his cane tapping lightly against the stone path. "I see he's still here," Marcelino remarked, his tone neutral but unmistakably pointed. Alora didn't look up from her task. "He is," she replied, her voice steady. "For now." Marcelino's gaze followed Finley as she chased a butterfly, her energy seemingly endless. "And how are you handling it?" Alora paused, setting the shears aside as she straightened. "It's complicated," she admitted. "Finley deserves the chance to know him, but I can't forget how he left us. I don't trust him, not entirely." "Nor should you," Marcelino said, his voice firm. "Trust isn't something that's earned overnight, and a man who abandons his family has a long road ahead of him if he's even willing to walk it." His words, while blunt, carried an undercurrent of protectiveness that Alora found both surprising and reassuring. She turned to him, her brow furrowing slightly. "You don't have to worry about us, you know." Marcelino met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I disagree," he said simply. "Finley is unique. Her energy, her perspective, it's rare. It would be a shame if someone like him disrupted that." Alora opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by Finley's cheerful shout. "Mummy, Mr. Beckett, look!" she called, holding up a bright yellow daisy. "It's the biggest one I've found!" Marcelino's lips twitched in the faintest semblance of a smile. "Very impressive," he said, inclining his head toward the little girl. Finley beamed, her grin wide and unabashed, before darting off to find more treasures. Alora watched her daughter with a soft smile before glancing back at Marcelino. "She's resilient," she said, "but I still worry." "You wouldn't be her mother if you didn't," Marcelino replied. Before Alora could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention. Zayden appeared at the edge of the garden, his presence instantly altering the atmosphere. He carried a small bouquet of flowers, likely picked from a nearby patch, and his expression was cautious but hopeful. "Finley asked me to help her find more flowers," he said, his gaze flickering between Alora and Marcelino. Marcelino's stance stiffened slightly, but he didn't speak. Alora forced a polite nod. "She's over there," she said, gesturing toward a cluster of shrubs where Finley was still exploring. Zayden nodded in thanks and walked in Finley's direction, leaving Alora and Marcelino behind. "You're giving him more access than I expected," Marcelino said after a moment, his tone low. Alora exhaled, crossing her arms. "She's a child," she said. "If there's a chance for her to have a relationship with her father, I can't take that away from her." Marcelino didn't reply immediately, his gaze following Zayden and Finley. "Just be careful," he said finally. "Not every bond is worth salvaging." The rest of the afternoon unfolded with a tentative ease that felt almost unnatural. Zayden remained with Finley, helping her collect flowers and occasionally lifting her onto his shoulders so she could reach higher branches. Alora watched from a distance, her arms crossed tightly as if to shield herself from the unfamiliar sight of Zayden playing the role of a father. Marcelino stood beside her, his silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. "She's enjoying herself," Marcelino said after a while, his tone devoid of judgment but still carrying its usual weight. "She is," Alora admitted, her voice quieter. "But that doesn't mean it will last." Marcelino turned to her, his gaze steady. "And if it doesn't, you'll have to pick up the pieces." Alora sighed, a hint of weariness creeping into her posture. "I always have," she said simply. The honesty of her words struck Marcelino in a way he hadn't expected. He was no stranger to loss and disappointment, but Alora's resilience, the quiet strength she carried in the face of so much uncertainty, was something he couldn't ignore. When Finley finally came bounding back toward them, her arms full of flowers, her face lit up with unbridled joy. "Mommy, look! Daddy helped me find the prettiest ones!" she exclaimed, holding up the bundle proudly. Alora forced a smile, bending down to admire her daughter's handiwork. "They're beautiful, sweetheart," she said, brushing a stray curl from Finley's face. Zayden approached a moment later, his steps slower, more cautious. "She's got quite the eye for detail," he said, his tone almost sheepish. "Takes after her mum." Alora straightened, her expression neutral. "Finley takes after herself," she said, her words pointed but not unkind. Zayden nodded, his gaze dropping briefly. "I'd like to spend more time with her," he said, his voice low. "If that's okay with you." Alora hesitated, her instincts warring with her desire to give Finley what she deserved. "We'll see," she said finally. "One step at a time." Zayden seemed to accept her answer, though a flicker of frustration crossed his features. "Fair enough," he said. "Thank you." As Zayden walked back toward the house, Finley skipped after him, chattering excitedly about their next flower hunt. Alora watched them go, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. "You're more patient than I expected," Marcelino remarked, breaking the silence. "I don't feel patient," Alora admitted, her voice tinged with fatigue. "I feel uncertain, like I'm walking a tightrope and hoping it doesn't snap." Marcelino nodded thoughtfully. "Uncertainty is exhausting," he said. "But it's also necessary. It forces you to decide what's worth holding on to." "And what do you think?" Alora asked, turning to him. "Do you think he's worth holding on to?" Marcelino hesitated, his gaze drifting to where Finley's laughter echoed through the garden. "I think that's a question only you can answer," he said finally. "But whatever you decide, don't let him take more from you than he's already taken." His words lingered, heavy with both caution and understanding. For the first time, Alora felt a sense of solidarity with Marcelino, an unspoken acknowledgement of the burdens they both carried. That evening, as Alora tucked Finley into bed, her daughter's small voice broke the quiet. "Mommy, do you think Daddy will stay this time?" Alora froze for a moment, her heart aching at the hope in Finley's eyes. She leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her daughter's forehead. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said softly. "But no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." Finley smiled sleepily, her trust in her mother unshaken. As her breathing evened out, Alora sat by the window, staring out at the darkened estate. Marcelino's words replayed in her mind, grounding her even as doubts swirled. Whatever the future held, one thing was certain: she wouldn't let Zayden disrupt the life she had built for herself and Finley. And if he did, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. The tension in the mansion was palpable the next morning. Alora couldn't shake the uneasy feeling left by Zayden's growing presence. Though his interactions with Finley had been harmless so far, there was something about his sudden return that felt unsettling, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. She carried these thoughts with her as she made her way to Marcelino's study for their scheduled therapy session. When she arrived, she found him standing by the window, his silhouette framed by the morning light. He held a document in his hand, but his attention seemed elsewhere, his gaze fixed on the garden below. "Good morning," Alora greeted, her voice breaking the quiet. Marcelino turned, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "Good morning," he replied, setting the paper on his desk. "Ready to begin?" "Always," Alora said, keeping her tone light. She moved toward the therapy equipment near the window, organizing the materials they'd need for the session. As she worked, she couldn't help but glance at him, noticing the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly, as if he were holding something back. They began the session in silence, Marcelino following her instructions with his usual precision. But as the minutes passed, Alora felt the weight of his unspoken thoughts pressing down on the room. "Something on your mind?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. Marcelino paused mid-exercise, his sharp gaze meeting hers. "Zayden," he said simply. Alora's stomach tightened. She should have expected this. Marcelino wasn't one to let things go unaddressed, especially when they involved potential disruptions to the fragile balance of his world. "What about him?" she asked, keeping her tone even. "I don't trust him," Marcelino said bluntly. "The way he appeared out of nowhere, the way he's suddenly so eager to play the role of father, it doesn't sit right with me." Alora sighed, setting down the resistance band she'd been holding. "Do you think I trust him?" she countered. "Because I don't. But Finley, she deserves to make her own decisions about him, even if it's hard for me." Marcelino studied her, his expression softening slightly. "You're putting a lot on yourself," he said quietly. "You always do." Alora's lips curved into a faint smile. "Isn't that what being a parent is about?" "Perhaps," Marcelino said, his voice thoughtful. "But it doesn't mean you have to shoulder it alone." The sincerity in his tone caught Alora off guard. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway. Mrs. Wilson appeared in the doorway, her normally composed expression tinged with concern. "Miss Harper," she said, "it's Finley. She's upset." Alora's heart clenched at Mrs. Wilson's words, and she immediately set aside her work. "What happened?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "She's in the garden," Mrs. Wilson said, her tone as calm as ever, though her eyes betrayed a hint of worry. "Mr. Calloway tried to talk to her about something, and she didn't take it well. She's asking for you." Without hesitation, Alora bolted from the study, Marcelino close behind. She barely registered the sound of his cane tapping against the polished floor as they made their way toward the garden. Her mind raced, torn between anger at Zayden for upsetting Finley and worry over what he might have said. When she reached the garden, she found Finley sitting on the edge of the fountain, her small frame hunched as she hugged her knees. Zayden stood a few feet away, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression a mix of frustration and regret. As Alora approached, Finley's head shot up, her tear-streaked face crumpling the moment she saw her mother. "Mommy!" she cried, scrambling to her feet and running into Alora's arms. Alora knelt, holding her tightly. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured, stroking Finley's hair. "I'm here. What's wrong?" Finley hiccuped, her small body trembling against Alora. "Daddy, he said he's going to leave again," she sobbed. "Why does he keep leaving?" Alora's stomach twisted, a mix of fury and heartbreak washing over her. She glanced up at Zayden, her eyes blazing. "What did you say to her?" she demanded, her voice low but laced with steel. "I didn't mean to upset her," Zayden said quickly, holding up his hands. "I was just trying to explain that I might have to leave for work, but I told her I'd come back." "Do you hear yourself?" Alora snapped. "She's 6 years old, Zayden. You can't just waltz in and out of her life like it's some revolving door. She doesn't understand your work commitments. All she knows is that you're not there." "I'm trying, Alora," Zayden said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I'm doing my best." "Well, your best isn't good enough," Alora shot back, her arms tightening around Finley. "If you can't commit to being here for her, then don't come around at all." The tension between them crackled like a live wire, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Marcelino, who had been standing quietly at a distance, finally stepped forward. His presence was calm but commanding, his sharp gaze cutting through the heated exchange. "Perhaps this conversation would be better had elsewhere," he said, his tone firm but even. "Finley doesn't need to hear this." Alora exhaled sharply, nodding. "You're right," she said, her voice softening as she looked down at her daughter. "Come on, sweetheart, let's go inside." Finley sniffled, but nodded, her grip on Alora's hand unrelenting. As they walked back toward the house, Alora cast one final look at Zayden, her expression a mixture of disappointment and resolve. He remained where he was, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the situation seemed to settle over him. Once inside, Alora settled Finley on the couch with her favorite blanket and a cup of warm milk. She stayed close, holding her daughter's hand as Finley's tears finally began to subside. Marcelino lingered nearby, his quiet presence a source of unexpected comfort. "I don't want him to leave again," Finley murmured, her voice small. Alora's heart broke all over again. "I know, baby," she said softly. "But no matter what, I'll always be here for you. You don't ever have to worry about that." Finley nodded sleepily, her eyelids growing heavy. As she drifted off, Alora leaned back, her own exhaustion beginning to creep in. Marcelino spoke after a long silence. "You handled that well," he said, his voice low. Alora glanced at him, a tired smile tugging at her lips. "I don't feel like I did." "You did," Marcelino insisted. "And for what it's worth, I agree with you. If Zayden can't give her stability, he has no business being here." Alora nodded, her gratitude evident in her expression. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." Marcelino held her gaze for a moment, his usual guardedness softening. "You don't have to face this alone, Alora," he said. "Not anymore." His words settled over her like a balm, and for the first time in a long while she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she wasn't as alone as she once believed. The tension between Alora and Zayden lingered like an unspoken shadow over the next few days. While Zayden made efforts to reconnect with Finley, his presence left a ripple of uncertainty in the carefully constructed stability of their lives. Alora kept a close watch, her protective instincts heightened as she tried to navigate the delicate balance between giving Finley the chance to know her father and shielding her from potential disappointment. One bright afternoon, Zayden suggested a family outing to a nearby park. Alora was hesitant but ultimately agreed, knowing that denying the request outright might raise questions in Finley's mind. Marcelino, ever the quiet observer, declined the invitation with a simple nod, leaving the three of them to embark on the outing alone. The park was a sprawling expanse of greenery, dotted with colourful playground equipment and shaded by tall oak trees. Finley ran ahead the moment they arrived, her laughter ringing out as she darted toward the swings. Zayden followed closely, his enthusiasm matching hers as he pushed her higher and higher, her delighted squeals filling the air. Alora watched from a nearby bench, her arms crossed as she observed the interaction. For all her doubts about Zayden, she couldn't deny the joy on Finley's face. It was a sight that both warmed her heart and tightened her chest with apprehension. "Mommy, come swing with us," Finley called, waving her arms excitedly. Alora shook her head with a smile. "I'm fine here, sweetheart," she said. "You two have fun." Zayden glanced her way, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face before he turned back to Finley. "Ready for the slide?" he asked, his tone light. "Yeah," Finley cheered, grabbing his hand as they raced toward the brightly colored jungle gym. Alora's eyes followed them, her smile fading slightly as unease crept in. For all his charm and apparent effort, she couldn't shake the feeling that Zayden's motives weren't entirely selfless. The afternoon unfolded in a blur of activity, with Zayden and Finley exploring every corner of the park. Alora joined them occasionally, her presence more of a steady anchor than an active participant. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows over the park, Zayden suggested one final activity, the nearby nature trail. "It's short, and Finley will love it," he said, his tone almost pleading. Alora hesitated, but ultimately nodded. "Okay, but stay close to her," she said firmly. "No wandering off." "Got it," Zayden replied with a grin, taking Finley's hand as they started down the trail. Alora followed a few steps behind, her gaze flickering between the two as they moved along the winding path. The trail was peaceful, lined with wildflowers and the occasional chirping bird. For a moment she allowed herself to relax, the tension in her shoulders easing as Finley's laughter echoed through the trees. But the calm shattered in an instant when she realized Finley was no longer in sight. Alora's heart lurched as she scanned the trail, her eyes darting from side to side. "Finley!" she called, her voice sharp with panic. The only response was the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. She spun around to Zayden, who looked equally alarmed. "Where is she?" Alora demanded, her voice rising. "She was just here," Zayden stammered, his confident demeanor crumbling. "She must have run ahead. I'll find her." "No, we'll both find her," Alora snapped, already moving down the path. Her pulse pounded in her ears as her thoughts spiraled. How could she have let this happen? Finley had never strayed far before, always mindful of staying close. "Finley!" she shouted again, her voice echoing through the trees. Zayden followed closely, his expression a mix of fear and guilt as he called out as well. After what felt like an eternity, Alora heard a faint voice in the distance. "Mommy, over here!" Relief washed over her as she raced toward the sound, rounding a bend in the trail to find Finley crouched by a small stream. She was unharmed, her cheeks flushed with excitement as she pointed at a collection of pebbles glittering in the sunlight. "Look what I found!" Finley exclaimed, holding up a handful of the shiny stones. Alora dropped to her knees beside her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Don't ever run off like that again," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and relief. "You scared me." "I'm sorry, Mommy," Finley said softly, her small arms wrapping around Alora's neck. "I didn't mean to." Zayden approached cautiously, his face pale. "She's okay," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Thank God." Alora shot him a withering glare as she pulled back to look at Finley. "Stay with me, sweetheart," she said firmly, taking her daughter's hand. She stood and turned to Zayden, her anger barely contained. "This is exactly why I had doubts about this outing. You're supposed to be watching her, not letting her wander off." I didn't mean for this to happen, Zayden said, his voice heavy with regret. She was right there and then— But she wasn't, Alora interrupted, her tone icy. You say you want to be part of her life, but you don't understand what that means. It's not just about showing up when it's convenient. It's about being responsible, about keeping her safe. Zayden fell silent, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. Alora turned away, her grip on Finley's hand tightening as she started back down the trail. Zayden followed at a distance, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet shame. When they reached the park entrance, Marcelino's sleek black car was waiting. He stepped out as they approached, his sharp gaze immediately assessing the situation. What happened? He asked, his voice calm but tinged with concern. Alora shook her head, her exhaustion evident. I'll explain later, she said, guiding Finley toward the car. I just want to get home. Marcelino's eyes lingered on Zayden, his expression hardening as he took in the other man's disheveled state. Without another word, he opened the car door for Alora and Finley, his presence a steadying force amidst the chaos of the day. That evening, as Alora tucked Finley into bed, her daughter looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. "Mommy, is Daddy mad at me?" she asked quietly. Alora's heart ached at the question. "No, sweetheart," she said softly, brushing a curl from Finley's face. "He's not mad. He's just learning how to be better at taking care of you." Finley nodded sleepily, her trust in her mother unshaken. As she drifted off, Alora sat by the window, staring out into the night. She knew Zayden's intentions might have been good, but his carelessness had only reinforced her fears. Finley's safety wasn't something she could compromise, not for anyone. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Marcelino stepped inside, his expression as composed as ever, but with a hint of something softer in his gaze. "Is she okay?" he asked, his voice low. "She's fine," Alora said, her voice weary. "It's just a lot." Marcelino nodded, stepping further into the room. "You did the right thing, Alora. Zayden isn't ready to be the father she needs." "I know," Alora said quietly. "But how do I explain that to her? How do I protect her without breaking her heart?" Marcelino's gaze softened. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," he said. "But you're doing more for her than you realize. And you're not alone in this." The sincerity in his words settled over her like a balm, easing the tension in her chest. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, the weight of the afternoon beginning to lift. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcelino inclined his head. "Always." The storm that rolled through the estate the next morning seemed almost fitting. Heavy rain lashed against the windows, and the distant rumble of thunder created an uneasy backdrop to an already tense atmosphere. Alora stood in the kitchen, staring at her untouched cup of coffee. Finley was still asleep, her small form curled up under a thick blanket in the adjacent room. Marcelino's earlier words replayed in Alora's mind. "You're doing more for her than you realize." As much as she appreciated his reassurance, the cracks in her resolve were beginning to show. The park incident had shaken her more than she cared to admit. Zayden's carelessness had been a reminder of why she'd spent so many years keeping him at a distance. Yet now, with Finley asking about her father every day, she felt trapped in a delicate balancing act. One misstep, and the fragile threads she had worked so hard to hold together could unravel. The sound of the front door opening jolted her from her thoughts. Marcelino entered the room, his dark coat damp from the rain. He looked every bit the commanding presence he always was, though there was a quiet concern etched into his features. "You're up early," he remarked, his gaze sweeping over her. "Couldn't sleep?" Alora shook her head, her fingers tightening around the mug. "Not really. My mind won't stop running. Marcelino nodded, understanding evident in his expression. He removed his coat, hanging it neatly by the door before stepping closer. You've been carrying too much for too long, he said. It's starting to show. Alora let out a soft, humorless laugh. I don't have much of a choice, do I? It's not like I can just hand this off to someone else. Perhaps not, Marcelino conceded. But that doesn't mean you have to face it all alone. Before Alora could respond, a small voice interrupted them. Mommy! She turned to find Finley standing in the doorway, rubbing her eyes sleepily. Her hair was tousled, and she clutched her favorite stuffed rabbit tightly. Good morning, sweetheart, Alora said gently, setting the mug down as she crouched to her daughter's level. Did you sleep okay? Finley nodded but glanced hesitantly at Marcelino. Are you mad at Daddy? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question caught Alora off guard. She exchanged a glance with Marcelino, whose expression remained neutral but attentive. No, honey, Alora said carefully. I'm not mad. I just want to make sure he does the right thing for you. Finley frowned, her little brows knitting together. But he said he's trying. Doesn't that count? Alora's heart ached at the innocence of her daughter's words. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Finley's face. It does, she said softly. But sometimes trying isn't enough. People have to show they can be there no matter what. Finley seemed to consider this, her gaze dropping to the floor. I just want him to stay, she whispered. Alora pulled Finley into a gentle hug, holding her close as she fought to keep her own emotions in check. I know, sweetheart, she murmured. I want what's best for you, and sometimes that means being really careful about who we let into our lives. Finley didn't respond, but her small hands gripped Alora's shirt tightly. After a few moments, she pulled back and looked up, her wide eyes filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Can we give him one more chance? The words hit Alora like a blow. She glanced at Marcelino, searching his face for guidance, but his expression remained carefully neutral. She knew the decision was hers alone to make, and it wasn't one she could take lightly. We'll see, Alora said finally, her voice steady but non-committal. For now, let's just focus on today, okay? Finley nodded, her trust in her mother unwavering. She wandered over to the kitchen table where her favorite crayons were waiting and began doodling quietly. Alora exhaled a long, shaky breath, feeling the weight of the conversation settle over her. You handled that well, Marcelino said after a moment, his voice low and steady. Alora turned to him, her exhaustion evident. Did I? She asked, her tone tinged with doubt. Because it feels like I'm just fumbling through all of this. Marcelino's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, his presence grounding. You're doing what any good parent would do, he said. You're putting her needs above everything else. That's not fumbling, that's strength. Alora managed a small, grateful smile. Thank you, she said quietly. Before the conversation could continue, a knock at the door broke the moment. Marcelino's posture straightened instantly, his sharp gaze flicking toward the sound. Alora moved to answer it, her heart sinking when she saw Zayden standing on the other side. His face was drawn, and he looked more disheveled than usual, as if the weight of the past few days had taken a toll on him. Alora, he began, his tone tentative. I know I messed up at the park, and I know I've got a lot to prove. But I'm not giving up. I need you to understand that. Alora stepped outside, closing the door behind her to keep Finley from overhearing. It's not about what I understand, Zayden, she said, her voice firm but not unkind. It's about what you show her. Actions speak louder than words, and so far your actions have only shown me that you're not ready. I can be ready, Zayden said, his desperation seeping into his voice. I just need time. Time isn't a luxury when it comes to Finley, Alora countered. She needs consistency, Zayden, not promises you might not be able to keep. Zayden raked a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. I'm trying, Alora, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm trying. Alora's resolve wavered, but only slightly. Then show me, she said. Show me that you're capable of putting her first, even when it's hard. Until then, I can't let you have more than small supervised visits. I won't risk her getting hurt again. Zayden's shoulders sagged, but he nodded. I'll do whatever it takes, he said quietly. Just don't shut me out completely. Alora hesitated before answering. That's up to you, she said finally. It always has been. As Zayden walked away, Alora leaned against the door, her exhaustion settling deeper into her bones. Marcelino, who had been watching from the kitchen, stepped forward as she re-entered. He's persistent, Marcelino observed, his tone carefully neutral. Too little, too late, Alora replied, shaking her head. I want to believe he can change, but I can't afford to gamble with Finley's happiness. Marcelino nodded, his expression thoughtful. Then don't, he said simply. Your instincts have gotten you this far. Trust them. Alora glanced at him, her gratitude clear. You make it sound so simple. It's not, Marcelino admitted. But you're not alone in this. His words carried a weight that settled over Alora, grounding her. For the first time in days, she felt a small measure of clarity. No matter how complicated things became with Zayden, she knew she could rely on Marcelino's steady presence to help her navigate the challenges ahead. The morning of the charity gala dawned with a crisp chill in the air, the kind that carried the promise of change. The mansion buzzed with activity as staff prepared for the evening's event, their movements purposeful and efficient. Alora stood in the kitchen, sipping her tea and mentally reviewing the day ahead. Despite the flurry of preparations, an air of calm had settled over her, a quiet determination that she couldn't quite explain. Finley ran into the room, her small hands clutching a drawing she had spent the morning working on. "Look, Mommy!" she exclaimed, holding up the colourful sketch of their family, her, Alora, and even Marcelino standing together in the garden. Alora knelt to admire the picture, her heart swelling at the sight of the simple yet heartfelt depiction. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, brushing a stray curl from Finley's face. "You're getting so good at drawing." "Do you think Mr. Beckett will like it?" Finley asked, her wide eyes brimming with anticipation. "I'm sure he'll love it," Alora replied with a smile, her gaze drifting toward the hallway where Marcelino's footsteps echoed. As if on cue, Marcelino entered the kitchen, his presence commanding yet unassuming. He glanced between Alora and Finley, his expression softening as he took in the scene. "What do we have here?" he asked, his voice warm but reserved. Finley eagerly held up the drawing. "It's for you," she said brightly. "It's us in the garden." Marcelino took the picture with a rare smile, his eyes scanning the details carefully. "You've captured it perfectly," he said, his tone sincere. "Thank you, Finley." Finley beamed, her delight infectious. Alora watched the exchange, a quiet sense of gratitude washing over her. Marcelino's bond with Finley had grown stronger over the weeks, and moments like these reminded her of just how much he had become a part of their lives. "Are you ready for tonight?" Marcelino asked, his gaze shifting to Alora. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, standing. "It's been a while since I've been to anything this formal." "You'll do fine," Marcelino said, his confidence in her unwavering. "And I'll be right there if you need anything." As the evening approached, the mansion transformed into a glittering spectacle. Chandeliers sparkled like constellations, casting warm light over the grand hall where tables were adorned with fresh floral arrangements and fine china. Guests began to arrive, their elegant attire and lively conversations filling the once quiet space with energy. Alora stood at the foot of the grand staircase, smoothing the folds of her evening gown. The deep emerald fabric hugged her frame gracefully, its simplicity accentuating her natural beauty. Finley stood beside her in a matching dress, her curls bouncing as she twirled excitedly. "You look beautiful, Mommy," Finley said with a grin, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "And you, my little princess, look stunning," Alora replied, brushing a gentle kiss on her daughter's forehead. Marcelino appeared at the top of the staircase, his tailored black suit lending him an air of quiet authority. When his gaze met Alora's, his usual stoicism faltered, replaced by a flicker of something softer. He descended the stairs with deliberate grace, his cane tapping lightly against the polished wood. "You both look lovely," he said, his voice steady but warm. "Finley, you might just outshine everyone here tonight." Finley giggled, clutching her mother's hand. "Thank you, Mr. Beckett." Alora felt a rush of heat rise to her cheeks as Marcelino's gaze lingered on her. "You clean up nicely yourself," she said, her tone light but genuine. "Shall we?" Marcelino extended an arm, and Alora hesitated briefly before slipping her hand through it. The gesture felt natural, a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken connection they had built. As they entered the hall, the hum of conversations momentarily quieted, all eyes turning toward them. Marcelino's presence commanded attention, but it was Alora and Finley who held the room's admiration. Guests whispered compliments, charmed by the trio's elegant yet unpretentious arrival. Marcelino guided them to their seats at the head table, where Alora found herself seated between him and an older gentleman she recognized as one of his business partners. The conversation flowed easily, and Alora was surprised by how quickly she adapted to the formal setting. Marcelino occasionally leaned in to offer a quiet word of encouragement, his steady presence easing her nerves. As the evening progressed, Marcelino rose to deliver his speech. The room fell silent, all eyes on him as he stepped to the podium. His voice, rich and measured, carried through the hall as he spoke about the importance of the evening's cause and the strength of the community. Then, to Alora's surprise, his tone shifted. "I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone who has had a profound impact on my life recently," he said, his gaze finding hers. "Alora Harper, your kindness, resilience, and unwavering dedication to your daughter have reminded me of what it means to truly live. You've brought light into a place I thought would remain dark forever." A soft murmur rippled through the room, and Alora felt her breath catch. Marcelino's words were unexpected, their sincerity cutting through the formalities of the evening. She met his gaze, her heart pounding as the corners of his lips curved into the faintest smile. The applause that followed was warm and genuine, but Alora barely registered it. Her focus remained on Marcelino, the weight of his words settling over her like a gentle embrace. For the first time, she realized just how deeply their lives had intertwined and how much she had come to rely on him. The aftermath of the gala left Alora with a swirl of emotions she couldn't quite articulate. Marcelino's heartfelt speech replayed in her mind, each word laced with sincerity that had left her both stunned and deeply moved. The way he had spoken about her, the way his gaze had found hers in a room full of people, felt like a moment suspended in time. She hadn't known how to respond then, and she still didn't now. The next morning she found herself in the garden, Finley happily chasing butterflies nearby. The fresh air was a welcome reprieve, though her thoughts remained tangled. Marcelino's words had stirred something in her, a hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. But hope was dangerous, she reminded herself. It made you vulnerable. Her contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. She turned to find Marcelino walking toward her, his cane tapping softly against the cobblestones. He looked every bit the composed man she had come to know, but there was a warmth in his expression that set her at ease. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're up early." "I could say the same about you," Alora replied with a small smile. "I thought you'd be resting after last night." Marcelino shrugged lightly. "Rest has never come easily for me," he admitted, his gaze drifting to where Finley was playing. "Besides, I thought you might want company." Alora arched a brow. "Is that so?" "Yes," Marcelino said simply, his tone earnest. "There's something I wanted to discuss." Alora's chest tightened slightly, though she kept her expression neutral. "What is it?" He hesitated briefly before meeting her gaze. "Zayden." The mention of his name sent a ripple of tension through Alora. "What about him?" Marcelino's expression grew serious. "I received a call this morning from someone on my staff. Zayden approached one of the board members at the gala last night, asking for financial backing for some project of his. They declined, but the fact that he's seeking support from my circle concerns me." Alora's stomach sank. "What kind of project?" "He didn't share specifics," Marcelino said, "but the timing, combined with his sudden interest in Finley, raises questions." Alora's grip tightened on the garden shears in her hand, her thoughts racing. "You think he's using Finley to get closer to your network?" she asked, her voice low but edged with frustration. Marcelino's expression remained calm, though there was a sharpness in his eyes. "It's a possibility we can't ignore. His behavior aligns too conveniently with his reappearance in your lives." Alora exhaled, setting the shears down as she processed his words. I thought maybe he was trying to make amends, for Finley's sake. But if what you're saying is true—" Her voice broke slightly, and she pressed her lips together to steady herself. "I can't let him use her like that." "You're right," Marcelino said, his voice firm but not unkind. "But confronting him directly without evidence could make things worse. He'll deny it, and it might put Finley in a more vulnerable position." Alora nodded, her jaw tightening as she fought to keep her emotions in check. "Then what do we do?" Marcelino's gaze softened, though his tone remained resolute. "We wait. I've already asked my team to keep an eye on his movements. If there's something more to his actions, we'll find out. In the meantime, keep your boundaries firm. Don't let him manipulate you." Alora let out a shaky breath, grateful for Marcelino's steady presence. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know how I'd handle this without you." "You don't have to handle it alone," Marcelino said simply. "You've carried enough on your own already." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Finley's laughter as she ran toward them, her arms full of wildflowers. "Look, Mommy, I found so many pretty ones," she exclaimed, holding them up proudly. "They're beautiful, sweetheart," Alora said, crouching to admire the bouquet. She glanced at Marcelino, who offered Finley a rare, genuine smile. "Mr. Beckett, do you want one?" Finley asked, holding out a single flower. Marcelino hesitated briefly before taking it. "Thank you, Finley," he said, his voice softer than usual. As Finley darted off again, Alora and Marcelino exchanged a quiet look. Though the storm with Zayden loomed on the horizon, this moment, simple and unguarded, felt like a much-needed anchor in the chaos. The garden was alive with color and warmth as the afternoon sun bathed the estate in a golden glow. Finley ran ahead, her laughter ringing out as she wove between the flower beds. Alora walked slowly behind her, savoring the peace of the moment. After weeks of uncertainty and emotional upheaval, the air finally felt lighter. Zayden's departure had been difficult but necessary. The evidence Marcelino's team uncovered had confirmed her worst fears. Xaden's motives weren't as pure as he claimed. While Alora grieved the loss of the ideal she'd held for Finley's sake, she knew she had made the right choice. Marcelino joined her in the garden, his familiar presence grounding her. He carried a wicker basket filled with sandwiches and fresh fruit, his stride as steady as ever, despite the cane at his side. "Perfect weather for a picnic," he remarked, glancing toward Finley, who was already spreading out the blanket they'd brought. "It is," Alora agreed, her lips curving into a smile. "Finley's been talking about this all morning." "She's persistent," Marcelino said, his tone carrying a faint trace of amusement. "I can see where she gets it." Alora laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "She's been looking forward to some normalcy. After everything that's happened, I think she just wants to feel secure." "And you?" Marcelino asked, his voice quieter. "Do you feel secure?" Alora met his gaze, the sincerity in his question catching her off guard. "I think I'm getting there," she said honestly. "It's not easy, but knowing Finley is safe helps, and knowing I'm not doing this alone anymore, it makes a difference." Marcelino nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You've been strong for so long, Alora. It's not weakness to let someone share the weight." The words resonated deeply, and for a moment Alora felt the tension in her chest ease. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his in a quiet gesture of gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. They joined Finley on the blanket, her excitement contagious as she chatted about her plans to draw a new family portrait. Marcelino listened attentively, his focus unwavering as Finley described each detail. Alora watched them, her heart swelling with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. As the sun began its slow descent, casting a warm amber light across the garden, Finley finished her sandwiches and sprang to her feet. "I'm going to pick more flowers," she declared, darting toward a patch of daisies nearby. Alora laughed softly, shaking her head. "She never runs out of energy." Marcelino's gaze followed Finley, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "She's remarkable," he said simply. Alora turned to him, her expression softening. "She adores you, you know. You've been so good to her, to us. I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough." "You don't need to thank me," Marcelino replied, his tone quiet but firm. "You and Finley, you've given me more than I could ever repay. You've reminded me what it means to have a purpose, to have hope." Alora felt her breath catch at his words. She had seen Marcelino change over the months, watched as the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. The man who once isolated himself in his mansion had become someone who cared deeply, who wasn't afraid to show vulnerability. And somewhere along the way, she had realized just how much she had come to rely on him, not just as a protector, but as a partner. As if sensing the shift in her thoughts, Marcelino reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Alora's eyes widened as he opened it, revealing a delicate ring with a single sparkling diamond. "I didn't plan to do this here," he admitted, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "But it feels right. Alora, you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You've given me a family, a reason to keep going. I don't want to face another day without you by my side." Alora's heart swelled, her hand flying to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. "Marcelino," she whispered, her voice trembling. Finley, noticing the moment, ran over and gasped when she saw the ring. "Mommy, is Mr. Beckett asking you to marry him?" Marcelino smiled, his gaze shifting to Finley. "I am," he said, "but I'd like your blessing too, Finley. Can I be part of your family?" Finley's face lit up, her excitement bubbling over. "Yes, yes! You can be my daddy too. Alora laughed through her tears, her heart bursting with love. She looked at Marcelino, her voice full of emotion as she said, "Yes." 1,000 times, yes. As Marcelino slipped the ring onto her finger, Finley threw her arms around both of them, her laughter filling the air. The three of them stood together, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, a family bound by love, trust, and hope for the future.